Hello, and welcome to my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve some great problems in philosophy and physics, in biology, and in psychology. I also hope to reach any of you wondering about the deepest nature of reality and our place in the universe. We live in the information age, but I find that very few philosophers or scientists understand the nature of information. Information is neither matter nor energy. It needs matter to be embodied in our brains, for example, and it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy are conserved quantities. It may be hard to believe, but the total amount of matter and energy today is the same as there was at the beginning of the universe, nearly 14 billion years ago. And if the stuff of the material world is just a fixed total amount, what can possibly explain all the evolutionary change that we see? The changes are the information and order in the universe, which have been increasing since the beginning of time, despite the second law of thermodynamics, which suggests that increasing entropy will destroy order and information. Now, the change is simply the arrangement of the atoms and molecules into what I call information structures, like the galaxies, the stars, and the planets. Stars are passive objects under the complete control of physical forces like gravity and nuclear forces and so forth. But living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures under our own control. I'll show that we are forms through which matter and energy flow continuously, and I'll show its information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thoughts in our minds that controls those flows of matter and energy. Information is the modern spirit, the ghost in the machine, the mind in the body. It is our souls, and when we die, it's our information that perishes. Only the matter remains. Well, welcome to my third lecture on great problems in philosophy and physics, biology, and psychology. And I have some unusual new work I've done today in the area of problems on the website. But the main page is up on this screen, which I can take a look at here. I've had this page up for a while, but I've now given it more pride of place on the website, as we'll see in a moment. My problems work is taken from my second book, published last year, called Great Problems of Philosophy and Physics, ? Solved. I'm trying to be a little less hubristic than the title would suggest. You know, is it really possible that one single thinker like me, although I've spent 60 years at the task, gotten a PhD in quantum physics and astrophysics, and I've studied a very large number of philosophers. You can see that from my homepage here. Down the left-hand side of the homepage are some 200 philosophers that I've worked on through the years. And when you get through all the philosophers I've read about, you can come to about 100 or so scientists. Let's see, starting in here somewhere. All of these readings I've done were annotated articles or marginalia in my books, which in the last 20 years I've been writing up as individual pages that are resources for you. In many cases I've put some of the original work in their original languages and excerpted by scanning with my scanning machine these articles and putting them on the web for you, for philosophers out there or want to be philosophers who really don't have access to the library materials that I have. I've been fortunate enough to been here at Harvard for all these years and access to the Widener Library, where there's a magnificent collection of thousands and thousands of philosophy books and science books. And Harvard also gives me the privileges of going online right from my desk and looking up journal articles in all fields, almost all fields. It's just an absolutely wonderful resource, which my hope is to share that with you who may be someday young people around the world who want to learn more about these fundamental problems on which we base our whole understanding of who we are, how we've come to be on this planet, how we fit in someday perhaps with contact to other living forms in the universe, although that's faded a lot since I got my PhD back in the 60s. And I did a calculation at that time of the probability of contacting extraterrestrial life. There was quite a deal of interest, good deal of interest in that in those days. We built a special, NASA built a special telescope in Arecibo in Puerto Rico with a big dish that was listening for any sounds from space that seemed to be ordered information-bearing signals. We did find some very interesting periodic signals with a little beep, 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 beep that didn't seem at all the kind of randomness that the rest of the universe seems to show, or smooth, continuous behavior. Turned out the beep, 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 beep was a star that was so small it had shrunk down and it was rotating so quickly that you could hold your hand up to the star and see its light varying with beats of many times a second, and it became called a pulsar. It turned out to be a collapsed star that was now almost 100% neutrons. But anyway, I have been working on these problems for a very long time, and I hope to give you resources about all of them. My work has been, of course, this website, which contains so many hundred pages of my work and on various problems, like the problem of knowledge, the problem of value, the problem of free will and determinism, some very interesting questions about the mind, and a lot of work on quantum physics, especially around the work of Albert Einstein, as I will be lecturing on every Friday. Now, until today, I had no separate drop-down menu for problems, but this is brand new. I did this over the weekend, and I'll give you a look at it differently over here. You see that I have, at this point, about 16 or 17 different drop-down entries in the menu, and I hope to add a few more. The problems page itself is something that I have had a link to it from somewhere else on the website, but what we have right now is, let's go here, what we have now is this page, and if I go into problems, I see the drop-down, which may grow over time. Let me, while I'm, just before I jump into talking about some of the specific problems today, I'd like to show you that I've added something else over the weekend. I've added links to Facebook, my Facebook page, and my Twitter page, and my YouTube lectures. Let's go back to see the information philosopher for a moment and see if I can expand this a little bit. Better back up just a little bit. I can actually show you what happens when we work with these new entries here. On the tweet link, when you click on it, it opens up, share this link, or my followers, your followers, share this link, and it provides a link, and you can click in and so forth. You might have to log into your Twitter account, but it should, if you're using your Twitter quite a bit. It should go directly to your account. It will paste in the title of the page, and it will then let you just click and tweet to your followers. And of course, I'd appreciate it very much if you would do that. As far as the YouTube videos link, what that does is go to my YouTube page, and it'll show you recent videos. This was last week, Friday. Let's see, expand this a little bit. Lecture on Einstein and his light quantum hypothesis. So you can basically look at one of these lectures. For example, let's click on the Einstein lecture, and it should come on up by itself. So far, not doing that. And I noticed that it actually has a link here to one stream that's live now. Let me just click on that one and see what happens. And what we get there is an inset of what is happening now on YouTube. Let me demonstrate that to you by switching my page to a picture of myself in front of the screen behind me and see if that comes up. Well, now we see an interesting phenomenon here that I will just hold up my hand, and you see it, my hand doesn't appear right away because there's a significant delay in the picture. Now, I'm not sure you're seeing that, right? Because I have to go back here and look at it in the screen I'm seeing now. Sorry for all the confusion about that. This is quite a tricky thing to do. I've gone in and out of that YouTube page. So let me just close down YouTube here. Sorry for all the confusion about that. And come back to my pages here and my screen here. And here's the information philosopher here. So if I come back to the overall page and just shrink it down for a moment while we're discussing these things, I put a little explanation on the right side that you can now go to Twitter. I'll probably add a little one for Facebook, since now we have links to Facebook and how many likes and shares have been done over there at Facebook. And it also announces that this lecture series is live online weekdays at 3 o'clock. And it's quite wonderful. I'm really quite lucky to be lecturing not just to a class of 30 smart young Harvard students, as I did many years ago, but very privileged to be lecturing only to people who want to see what I'm doing. Now, as far as I can tell, the first 2 weeks of lectures have had just a handful of viewers, but some have sent in very nice comments and suggestions, and I've implemented some of those suggestions. I'm reading some works that people have suggested, and I look forward to many more of those as we grow. But let's come back to problems, because I'm advised by some of the people who wrote in about these one-hour lectures that there's a problem with these lectures. And I've answered some of that by letting viewers click into a link to Twitter and Facebook and so forth. But one of the general criticisms is these lectures are rather long. They're the same format I used to use with Harvard undergraduates when I was a teaching fellow. And I assumed at that time that 30 or so students would come into the classroom and we'd be working through ideas for an hour or so. It may be that 50 years later, the attention span of our younger students and even older ones have been considerably shortened by what the internet has done to us with web programming, often in bursts of a TED Talk, for example, that might last 15 or 20 minutes, or much shorter presentations that are tailored to just communicating an idea and hoping it will get a large number of people that will put their toe in the water with an interest in something. And in my case, as you can see, my webpage has some, my website now has some 20 or more problems that I wish I could introduce to people with a very short visual as possible, with animations or illustrations and graphs as I can. So one of my goals here is for each one of the drop-down pages that I have on the left side here, arrow of time, entanglement, evil, identity, mind-body, and so forth. My goal will be, right now I have a page for each of these, and those pages are rather lengthy. But I would hope that I would put at the top of each one of these pages a short video, a video as I can make to explain that problem. And I think the format will be, let's just jump into what the problem is, and then say what information philosophy might have to say about that problem in the nature of a solution, a suggested solution to how you might think about it, rather than just arguing about it verbally, or arguing with words may or may not ever get to some resolution because of the fundamental ambiguity of words as I find it. Let's take a look at this page. And these are the introductory paragraphs I've had up for some time. I may rewrite them one of these days, but basically I argue that we've got some great questions of philosophy for which information philosophy now does provide us with the possibility of fuller understanding. And even beyond understanding, plausible and practical, if tentative, solutions to these philosophical problems that have been known for many years, millennia in some cases, as well as major problems in physics that have come down to us from the 20th century. Now, if you read classic philosophy texts, the anthologies of great articles in philosophy, you'll find that in the 20th century, great philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, and that's a link to his page, labeled these problems as philosophical puzzles. There was a great deal of debate between Wittgenstein and the philosopher and part scientist Karl Popper whether these are really puzzles or should probably be called problems. And I tend to side with Popper in the idea that if these are problems, we might actually find solutions. But even the great Bertrand Russell, who was Wittgenstein's great mentor and brought him into logical positivism, the older Russell thought that Wittgenstein was young enough and skilled in engineering and mathematics and other things that he could put together a basic logical argument. But it wound up that the feeling that many of these became to be called pseudo-problems, especially the later Wittgenstein and today's analytic language philosophers thought that many of these problems could not be solved, but they could be dissolved. They could be shown to be pseudo-problems, revealing inside them conceptual errors that were caused by the misuse of language. And now the analytical philosopher Gilbert Ryle, halfway through the last century, called many of these problems, quote, category mistakes that could be avoided by very careful conceptual analysis. He said things were being compared that were not in the same category. For example, an attempt to connect mind to body, in his great book, Concept of Mind, concluded that the mind was not the same thing as the body or the brain, and that this was a metaphysical problem because an immaterial mind simply could not exist. Well, at least if it did exist, it would be of a different category and shouldn't be put in the same category with something like the body. So now, using this new methodology of information philosophy, I think I can put these classic problems back under consideration as genuinely important, as analyzable, and potentially soluble in terms of this new quantity of information that is the understructure for our information age. And as I've said before several times, although it's neither matter nor energy, immaterial information can interact causally with the more familiar contents of the physical world. And so I hope to say we can explain how an idea can move a mountain. All right, let's then take a look at some of these problems. And as we look at them quickly today, maybe you will come back to me with suggestions about how these problems might be boiled down into a 5-minute presentation, or maybe we should also have a 15-minute presentation and not try to devote a whole hour to them until later times, at least help now by developing the short problems. If you want to tell me your thoughts, you can reach me, Bob Doyle, at informationphilosopher.com. So let's take a look at this, see if when I do this I can keep that screen up there. Let's go back to this list. I do keep my email address at the bottom of the screen, another thing I just learned this week. Now, as you know, my first book was about this enormous problem of free will. And this book came out in 2011, and at the time I regarded it as somewhat of a scandal on the grounds that what was being taught by most philosophers, and that is the case, most philosophers did not believe, or argued that one could not believe in, one could not show evidence for a free will, a will that was not predetermined by the laws of nature or the laws of physics, or because there was an omniscient God who knows exactly what we're going to do. There were a variety of determinisms that were out there that were supposedly making free will and the creative capability that a human being has that goes along with a free will, so that things that are happening are not just happening to us, but are happening because we are making them happen. I found that to be a scandal. And here I say that the problem with free will, as a problem, is are we determined or not? And the answer, the proposed solution, I found first in the work of William James in 1884. That is to say that free will is not a single entity. It's not just free will, one thing, and the free will does something, and because it involves indeterminism and randomness, it's not able to do something we think of as a responsible free will. And what I've been arguing is that I'd like to take the free and the will apart, and that is what William James said we should do back in 1884. First a sort of chance, then a choice. First alternative possibilities, and then one actuality. Let me just take a moment here to come over to this page on another screen, scroll up, and take a look at that screen with you. And what I have here is the ability to single out the lines I'm talking about, the idea of first free, then will, first chance, because we need some chance, William James said, some indeterminism, then choice. The first step is alternative possibilities, then one actuality. The most plausible and practical solution to this 2,400-year-old problem is a thing I call the Kazuto Model, where the critical random component of the first stage is provided by noise in the brain's information processing, which generates free thoughts, which are to be followed by adequately determined. And now adequate is a hedge term that says it's not predetermined, it's not predestined. None of our willed actions are a consequence of previous events in a causal chain. And the chance nature of a thought that just pops into one's head in no way makes the resulting action by the agent into a random action, just because the things we thought of were random. Now, that little bit took us about 4 minutes only, and that's a good sign. I will go back and look at this lecture and try to develop that one description of a problem into something that we could make up as a separate YouTube lecture and put it up there on YouTube and look for people who might be interested in that one to get their very first introduction in a very short step. So let's continue with what we're doing here, because in some of these, in this very first presentation, the idea is here usually in a single paragraph. Let me turn off my little screen here. Let's go over to this one and talk about the problem of value. Well, let's see. Once again, if I scroll to this screen, I can look at the page with you. What is the problem of value? At its deepest level, it's the question of whether there is an ultimate value in the universe, in the cosmos, or is all value dependent on ourselves? In ethics, the source of ethical values are often said to be centered in some traditional teaching that comes down through our cultural ancestors who may have turned such moral value systems into a religion, or in modern times, humanist philosophers who tried to argue that there are some basic principles which are value judgments, for example, universal ones like preservation of life, do unto others as you would unto yourself, and so forth. But in recent decades, the sources of values have been extended to when you talk about life. Is it human life that we are giving the greatest value to, or is it all life on the planet? So-called bioethics. And what I'm hoping to say briefly in this problem of value is that we might move the source of ultimate value beyond man and beyond our created religions, which are our own inventions, which tend to focus completely on life, some religions, of course, and afterlife, but they tend to focus on we human beings on the earth. And my thought, my goal and work in the where value might come from is to say that there may be an origin of our values in a kind of a cosmic providence. That is to say, the universe is a very friendly place, although some have thought it hostile in the past. And I'm going to argue that looking into the processes that have created the stable information structures in the universe, starting then with the most early material particles that formed 14 billion years ago, and then after a good deal of time went past, it was only 400 million years later, am I getting that right, that things like galaxies could form. And before that, a few 100,000 years, even before an atom could form out of a proton and an electron to make a hydrogen atom. So these were long periods of time, but relatively early in the universe. And all of these things, whether they are the material particles or the galaxies and the stars and the planets, I've basically called them ergo, which is a little play on René Descartes' cogito or cogito ergo sum, where the cogito is my mind model, which you see up here, and the ergo is my model for value. And I'm basically saying that value really is everything in the universe that is formed into an information structure with a potential for us to see it, recognize it, see the information in it, and get a picture of that information into our head. So I see, looking at this paragraph, which I will do again later by reviewing what we're saying here, is pretty thin. It doesn't really have much of what I told you in it, so I'd like to rewrite that. I could also go to the problem of value page and see if there's anything more interesting there. Let's open this in a new tab and see what that looks like. I asked the question, does goodness exist? We find this is a much more practical problem than whether God exists, and identifying objective goodness or value. If there was an objective goodness outside of human life, outside of life on Earth, and out there in the cosmos, that this could then uncover the nature of some things that are often attributed to a God. Now, those of us who are religious and looking for understanding their God, it seems to me, if my work will describe to them how it is that good providential things came into the universe, it could help them think about whatever their religious thoughts are. When I was a graduate student in undergraduate at Brown, I took a course in existentialism, which was very popular philosophy at the time, and they argued that good does not exist. And of course, they were frequently atheists as well, didn't think God exists. But most religions place their origin in a supernatural being. And humanists, as we said, felt that good was a human invention, starting way back with Protagoras, who said that man is the measure of all things, or the idea that there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. That's something William Shakespeare told us. And so modern bioethicists situate value in all life, all terrestrial life, protecting the planet and protecting all living things in it because of this value of the ecosystem to us. Today, people who think about traveling around to Mars and other planets, we could say it's all planetary resources. And I note a variety of ancient religions look to the sun as the source of all life, and thus of all good. And they were solar religions. Sometimes they thought the sky itself was God, and so that dark and the night were stigmatized as evil and fallen. All right, so that maybe that's enough to talk about problem of value. As I come back to this later, I will try to put together a package of those thoughts, which, of course, you can always go to I will, of course, go to my book and hope to find in my contents a chapter on value. Let's see what we have here. Physics of value doesn't seem to be here straight away. Free will, libertarianism. Wrong book. I want to look in Great Problems. So here is my taxonomy, which I developed a while ago. And what we want to do is choose this one, and this one, and see if we can home in on this. Maybe that's a little too tight. So much of the work I do is organize a lot of my thoughts over the years, and as my website is organized into sections with drop-down menus on particular things, this value book, this book on problems, has got philosophy's problems on this side of a taxonomy and physical science problems on this side, and we see we've got a section on value in here, so I should be able to find this in the book somewhere. And here we go. It says that it's on page 79. And let's just see how long we have to write about value. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Wow. So the book is not going to be any help, not much help anyway, to give us a 5-minute version. Perhaps it will help in our TED Talk version of around 15 minutes length. But like my website, I have tended to write a great deal on each one of these problems, and my goal is to make it much more quickly delivered to those who want a quick summary of what the problem is and whether or not they're interested enough that they'd like to go deeper into one of these problems. So at the top of my website, let's take a look back at this page for just a moment, and you'll see that I've all from the beginning, actually, my work in this concept I call information philosophy today, I used to call an ergodic philosophy after the ergo. And you'll see under my value drop-down, ergo is a concept. Under free will, my cogito is a concept. And under knowledge, the sum. So the cogito ergo sum was something I came up with in 1970 or even earlier that would divide my work and thinking into these three areas, which were classic areas. You know, it's like the good, the true, and not the beautiful, but the free. And my website consisted of only these three areas until several years into the work. And then in recent years, I've expanded into problems of the mind and problems of chance and the existence of indeterminate things in the universe, and then a lot of studies of individual problems at quantum physics. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the lecture, today I've added this drop-down on all the problems. So let's scroll down in problems again for a minute and see what we have and whether it's easy to kind of talk about them a little bit. This one, problem of knowledge, of course, is one of my oldest interests, and yet my work is sort of vectored off into different areas. The problem of knowledge is often known as epistemology, and I say it's more correctly the problem of whether we can achieve certain knowledge. Given that our means of perception, that is to say our experiences that provide us of knowledge, are obviously limited and fallible. It is the case that science is done in the presence of fallibility. All the experiments we do, none of them ever give us a true result. They never give us a logical, true result. And so our experiments cannot provide certain knowledge. Instead, it's knowledge that has a certain statistical argument for it. The evidence is always tentative evidence because someone may suggest a different theory which could explain the evidence we have to date, but then predict other predictions which upon testing turn out to be true. The great example are true in the sense of apparently agreement between the theory and the experimental results. The famous case there is Einstein and Newton's theory of the orbits were changed when Einstein did his work in general relativity and found that the orbit of Mercury behaved quite differently very slightly differently from Newton's theory. And that led us to a whole new bit of knowledge, which was more certain than what we knew before, but it was nevertheless not perfectly certain. So this notion of knowledge started out with logical debates about the things which are justified true beliefs in Plato's time. But today, I'm going to argue that information philosophy looks to information structures in the brain, in the mind, of course, that correspond in some way to external structures in the world and in other minds. So the correspondence, should there be one, is the quantitative isomorphism, or an overlap. An isomorphism means that there's a structure in the brain which has a mapping, a one-to-one mapping, between the internal information in minds and the external bits of information in physical structures or processes that we're trying to understand. So as I look at this, I wrote that line well over 10 years ago as what I think is the basis of problems in knowledge. Clearly we have a lot more to do to explain what the information is and how we can know what it is in an external object, and how it is we can know the internal structure of a mind and what information is in it. Both of those are extremely difficult problems, and as a result, philosophers for many years doubted that there was anything we could say about what's inside a mind. But today, we can not only say a good deal about what's in a mind by querying that person, by what's called introspection, by the days in the 19th century when people thought we could introspect into our own mind and find something about ourselves, and even find something about others by asking them to introspect. And then if we look into our minds and we and the others all seem to have an agreement about what it is we think we know, we think we have some kind of knowledge. Now, it was challenged for those in the 20th century who thought the minds were black boxes and we couldn't observe things in minds. We could only observe behaviors of animals and humans, and the proper work in psychology was converted away from thinking about minds to thinking about behaviors, which are observables, and the observable behaviors were thought to give rise to a psychology which would be a valid science rather than a metaphysical look into the brains and the minds, which we can see the neurons. Today we can see them amazingly clearly, but we cannot yet see where the information that's in a mind is stored. Some argue it may be at the edges, the connections between neurons, the synapses as they grow, or the connections out to the other dendrites. And we know those connections, those synapses are strengthened when they are used, and when a sensation is experienced by a person, certain neurons fire. Certain neurons in the visual cortex fire, and their synapses get strengthened, and then associated senses like smell and touch and taste and sound are all also have neuron structures which have their own pathways, which initially appear to be firing along the neuron, electrical pulses firing along the neuron. They're really chemical ionic pulses, get strengthened. And so we think we know, I do think we can describe an experience recorder in the mind, brain, which is putting bits of information into those neurons somewhere, just as the random access memory of our computers these days gets changed from zeros to ones in patterns of bits, which have the software, have the data inside a computer, so we have some sort of stored information which is there in the wiring and the pattern of the wiring together of the different neurons and the axons and their dendrites in a brain. And so, of course, the hope is that knowledge will someday will be understood as by neuroscientists who are looking into the areas of the brain with magnetic resonance studies and other studies of areas where activity is showing electric signals, or these ionic signals, and other signs of activity. Some tests measure with the blood flow around various parts of the brain to show us which parts of the brain are active at the same time. So today, knowledge is becoming a neuroscientific problem. So psychology, which is just sort of limited to introspection and thinking about what we are doing, is now becoming something where scientists can look in and see the activity of the brain. My argument is, though, or my understanding is that the resolution power, the ability to see things we know in the brain somewhere, is extremely gross. In other words, the scanners that we have today can only look at relatively large parts of the brain, so that, let's say, they can look at 1/100th even of a percent, say sort of one little volume associated with one neuron. It's still huge compared to the number of bits of information that are in an adult brain. There are some who think it's not stored at the cellular level, the neuron level. It's stored way down inside the cells with some of the structures in the cells, And while that's all very radical, it just raises the issue that we have a very large amount of information in our minds that knows a great deal about the world, about everyone around us and everything around us, and where is that stored is a big question about what exactly is the software in the hardware. So perhaps we'll take one more look at another problem here, and that one on the screen behind you is the problem of mental causation, which is closely related to how it is we know anything at all. And the idea of those who attack mental causation, and those are people who call themselves reductionists on the grounds that they think everything that's happening in a body is actually happening to us because our cells, which are down at the lowest biological level, and even below our cells, the chemistry that's going on in our cells is doing something, and the chemistry is just a phenomenon that emerges, is supervenient, they say, on what our atoms and molecules are doing. In other words, physicalists, they're called, and there are many of them where we've studied, notably Jaegmon Kim, who's emeritus at Brown right now, argues that everything is physical, by which he means material. And so if something is causing me to wave my hands, it must be that the atoms and molecules themselves are actually doing. They are the causes of our motions. And those causes, Kim argues, in this question about whether there's anything up here causing my hand to move, or whether it's just a thing that's happening up from our material body components, our molecules at the physical level and chemical level, and then the organic elements of our cells doing things, which make our cells do things. And then especially the most important cells are the ones in our brains, which do feel like the ones that are actually causing what we're doing. But nevertheless, Kim argues that the neurons themselves are just cells made up of chemistry and physics down below. And so if there is a cause, it should be a physical cause or a material cause. And if, he says, on top of this physical cause, physical layer, okay, if there's another layer called the mental layer, and if it's just nothing but information, which I do agree with, I argue we are, in our minds, there is information. It's embodied in our brain, but it is nevertheless worth thinking about as something abstract, something that could be communicated out of my mind into your mind, out of my mind into the words on a page in my website or in a book. That is something above and beyond the material level. And what Kim is saying is, if the cause is really always caused because of causal interactions, which are physical events happening here, then anything that happens at this upper mental level must be redundant, because for everything that happens in the brain, there's a parallel thing that happens in the mind. He can agree with that, but then he feels that the mental level is just epiphenomenal, it's called. It's something that is happening, a way of looking at what's happening at the physical material level, and nothing more than that. So that he wants to have explanations which include only the causes which are the real reasons everything is going on. Of course, I disagree with this, and I hope to be able to show something more specific about it. Let's take a look at what we say right here. The problem of mental causation is solved by showing how the information processing system of life emerged from matter, and in turn mind emerges from living things. And in both cases we hope to show that there's a clear downward causal control, and this is the argument in mental causation. It must be that the component atoms of our bodies are actually being part of the information processing system. And we also hope to show that thermal or quantal noise in the lower level is actually going to block any serious bottom-up causation, because there is no upward flow of information. The emergence of life from matter is what Erwin Schrödinger called order out of order. He called it life feeding on negative entropy. And I'm going to show that the emergence of mind from life is, quote, pure abstract information from order, and information is the stuff of thought. Okay, as I read that one to you, I see I went into areas that I do go into much more deeply in our pages, but it doesn't seem as if that one is going to serve as a 5-minute or shorter introduction to the problem of mental causation. And maybe we have time for one more here today, and it has a very tiny one paragraph, but it's an enormously important problem. Now, I just clicked away to the page on consciousness. I meant to just pick it out as something we can look at here for a moment. Let's go over to this page. Let me go to another page that I might be able to make this even bigger. No, I can't do very much more than that. So what I'm hoping to do with the concept of information is to say that consciousness can be defined in information terms as the property of an entity, and it can be a human being or a living thing. Living things, many of them, are conscious. We're finding more and more levels of a sort of consciousness downward into all animals, and even into things like plants that have a certain awareness and interaction with, reaction to changes in their environment. But also, I'm willing and comfortable to say that it could be even an entity like an artificially conscious machine, that is to say, a robot, or some computer which acting to notice what's going on in its environment. And if it perceives and reacts to the information, particularly to changes in the information in its environment, then we can call it information consciousness. Now, at this very deep level, even a thermostat in a house could be said to be certainly aware, quote, of the temperature in the room. And its job, the thermostat has a job, it wants to react, it wants to be conscious of what's going on in the room and keep it within a certain range of values. We've programmed it, we've built it physically. There's really no software except in the modern super thermostats like Next and others, who are indeed including lots of programming so that it works differently at different times, even in different spaces, managing different rooms differently, and so forth. There's a lot of intelligence in a modern thermostat, but the original concept, like the concept of a governor that used to be put on an automobile or a truck to prevent that truck from ever going faster than a speed limit, for example. The original governor is something that when it spins too fast, it denies gasoline. It sort of closes down the amount of gasoline that's allowed in the engine. So that governor in the engine or the thermostat in the room, both of them are noticing what is happening and taking action to prevent something going too far in one direction or another. In the car, not going too fast, and the thermostat not getting too hot or getting too cold. It's a very simple kind of awareness, which is a fundamental element of consciousness. And you can see what it is. If the temperature in the room falls too low, the thermostat closes a switch and turns on the furnace, which heats the room up as the temperature comes up and up and up, and gets, say, let's see, the temperature goes by the acceptable value, it opens that switch and turns it off. Now, consciousness is a much bigger problem than just being aware of something. As David Chalmers, we lectured on a couple of weeks ago in our first introductory lecture on problems, chose consciousness for that, and followed David Chalmers' argument that the important thing about consciousness is to explain the qualities of the feelings that we have around things, not just the information processing like the thermostat. That's the easy problem, says David Chalmers. The hard problem is to understand what it is we are feeling when we have an awareness of something. When we hear a huge explosion, we react, we have a worrisome feeling, maybe we need to get out of here. When we look at some things, smell a beautiful flower, we have a certain pleasant feeling. Those feelings, which philosophers call the qualia, that are associated, instead of the quantities of this or that, this qualia remains a very big problem. He calls it the hard problem of consciousness. And as I told you in a previous lecture, and we will in our consciousness summary, we connect this notion of the feelings with experiences in our brain that are encoded there, that have been burned in when neurons fired in our earlier versions of similar experiences. And that, whatever we had in our earlier first experiences of certain things, we may have had at the same time very good feelings or very bad feelings, but whatever we had when we have a similar experience coming up to us in the future, it brings back our earlier feelings about things we saw or felt or touched or smelled and so forth, so that our reaction, which is an emotional reaction to experiences, comes welling up in our minds, and we definitely feel it, and that is we suggest we have what I call an experience recorder that then gets reproduced at future experiences that have similarities. So that's a brief look at my work, my new website with the capability to show a drop-down for problems, and I hope that we'll work on those individually. And what I'd like to do here is click on our little music bed to say that we're coming to the end of this talk today on Monday, the 4th of December, beginning of our first week in talking to you. I hope you'll come on other days. Tomorrow we'll take up the free will problem and that book and explore some specifics of the free will problem. On Wednesday, we'll have a pick one philosopher. Wednesdays we'll look at a philosopher or a scientist and try to see what their contributions have been, where I'd like to perhaps praise them and bring their work to your attention, like the work of William James, especially on free will tomorrow. Or criticize them and say how they're all following a certain teaching that they've been teaching for ages, and maybe need to know a little more about how we might think of problems in philosophy and physics by looking at the information like that we're storing in our brains. As you listen to me now, I hope some of the things I say affect you and affect your thinking, and that's our basic tool of how we do what we do. On Thursdays, more of our deepest sort of look into the foundations of things, what goes on under things and behind things in metaphysics. And on Friday, we'll have our third lecture on Albert Einstein. And I am now 17 chapters into my book on Einstein's work. And I'm looking forward to finding enough time away from these lectures I'm giving every day to write the additional chapters, and hope to get this book out in early 2018. Let me remind you that these books, while they are print versions on Amazon and the Harvard Bookstore, they are all freely available on my website at informationphilosopher.com/books. So here I am at Information Philosopher here, and if I type in at the end, as time runs out on us here, I'll just type in books and encourage you to go there and take a look at my books and download them all, chapter at a time or the whole book at a time, and join me in my efforts to bring you a lot of new learning, as if you were in a class, as best I could do one for you. Thank you.